Welcome back to this 27th in a series of mini lectures on topics and principles of macroeconomics offered by me, James Sungroth, Professor of Economics at Austin Community College. Since we're all in lockdown to combat the coronavirus, I'm moving my lecture class online, and these little lectures over topics in my lecture outline are substitutes for giving lectures live in class, face-to-face, which would be much preferable to these. Anyway, let's get on with it. Let's go to our Blackboard course, which is the center of everything we do here now. And, well, it was pretty important before we got shelter-at-home orders from the government, federal, state, and local. Let's take a look right now at lecture topics, if I can find them. There they are. And let's open those up. Exam 2, open a new link. There it goes. There we go. So it's number 27. Let me see. This second one, I think, actually I hadn't given a lecture over 14 or 15 or I forget where my lecture started up. I believe it was 18. So 14, 15, 16, and 17, we were able to do face-to-face. Starting at 18, I started giving these mini lectures and have done 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and we're on the 27th now. So really 17 minus 27. So this is the 10th one I've done. Let's read it. So it follows from 26. 26 and 27 are very closely related. We took a look at classical economics, essentially the economics of liberalism as understood in the 19th century, not in the 20th. And what people in Latin America and Europe criticize as neoliberalism is just 19th century liberalism, which that liberalism sought to undermine and reduce the power of the state. Of course, all of those who want to see the state strengthened criticize liberalism. They call it neoliberalism now. So we're going over neoliberalism as expressed in economic theory. And we took a bird's eye view of that in topic number 26. We call this Classical Economists, okay? And of course, they didn't want the government to intervene when there were recessions or terrible inflations. In fact, they always found the origin of such crises in governmental actions and just thought if the government would leave the economy well enough alone, in other words, laissez-faire, let everyone pass freely, things would be all right. We're taking a look at their economic theory because Keynes is going to criticize it. And this course is basically a Keynesian economics course. So I thought we needed a quick glance at what he criticized and how he developed his theories from those criticisms. So right now, we're still taking a look at those theories, and we're going to put it in the terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Actually, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply. So let's get going. Let's go back and open up the PowerPoint. So I have all of the PowerPoints right here in my PowerPoint folder, and they're right here. you can see starting with 18, I have my lectures right below each topic, PowerPoint topic. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and this is the 10th. Very good. And I've already opened up the PowerPoint, so let's go to it. Here it is. So in this lecture, I'm going to be going over how the textbook approaches explaining the classical economic theory with aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply. And I believe the question, if we can go back to that very briefly, was show an inflationary gap, show a recessionary gap using those curves, and then show what happens in the long run to get us back to full employment equilibrium. And that is what these PowerPoints are doing. And we're going to take a look at the textbook's explanation, which is fine enough, but I'm going to add my own. Well, it's really not my own. It was the beginning of the undermining of Keynesian economics, starting in about 1968 on to 1980. So by Friedman and Phelps. But anyway, I said, let's show an expansionary gap. And I do have long-run aggregate supply, which, just to remind everyone, is a situation where this is full employment output. I just want everyone to realize that. So we have full employment. Gosh, my writing here in this pad is just terrible. Full employment output. And this really is the classical view of things. They would just have the long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. The short-run aggregate supply is like the Keynesian view, though originally the Keynesian view would have been more, and I will try to get rid of this as soon as I draw it. Something like this would have been the Keynesian view. So essentially, we could have had an equilibrium at less than full employment, okay? And there would be no tendency to go to full employment. Let me get rid of those so we can go back to the textbook explanation. But anyway, here we have aggregate demand intersecting short-run aggregate supply at a point greater than full employment. And this is an expansionary or inflationary gap. It's going to push prices up. So the idea was perhaps at one point aggregate demand might have originally been here, and it moved out for some reason unspecified to AD1, and this is aught 0. And so the price level goes from price level, let's just call it aught, to price level 1. And obviously we have an increase in the price level, which price level increase is inflationary. So we have an inflationary gap. All right. And what do we have? So the economy is at short-run equilibrium at Q sub 1. This Q sub n is a natural full employment level of GDP, or the potential output of the GDP in the long run. Since this actual output, is greater than full employment output, the economy is said to be an inflationary gap. It can only reach there not by an increase in output, but only by an increase in prices. And so that's the first case. The second case is a recessionary or contractionary gap, where the short-run equilibrium is right here. And so apparently, I guess we could call this a deflationary gap to make it parallel to the inflationary gap. Apparently, maybe the aggregate demand curve originally, and maybe that's why I should use a 0 or O, was here, and it moved to the left, creating a recession. And so output is below full employment. And one thing we would expect, besides falling employment and rising unemployment, would be either falling price levels or reduced inflation. Okay, so this would be the contractionary gap using our little long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And so the economy is there, output is less than full employment, all right? So, boom, let's go to the next one. So the economy is currently in a short-run equilibrium, actual level of GDP of Q1. The natural rate is greater. The actual rate is below what the economy can really produce. We're in a recessionary gap. Were there two of them just like this? No, there are two of them just like this. Nah, right? I think we can get rid of that one. No use in having two. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the economy and the labor market. And this is important because once we get to Keynes's general theory of employment, interest, and money, of course, employment has to do with the labor market. And Keynes thought the classical economists was a particular, not a general theory. It only was realized when real GDP was equal to natural GDP and the labor market was in equilibrium. But Keynes believed that the economy could be in an inflationary equilibrium where labor shortages exist and there is no tendency in the natural economy to reduce that, or it could be an equilibrium in a recessionary situation where unemployment was greater than the natural rate and there was a surplus in the labor market, which there was no tendency for the markets to remove. In other words, and this is where, I guess, stated from the classical perspective, it was hard for classical or liberal economists to accept this Keynesian theory because it would mean that the national equilibrium, we could have national equilibrium with the labor market being in disequilibrium, and there was no tendency for the labor market to move back into equilibrium. And so it's difficult for classical and liberal economists of the 19th century to accept that you could be in a national equilibrium with labor markets and maybe other markets out of equilibrium. It was just a So what? They would think we have a disequilibrium equilibrium. We have it's daytime, at nighttime, maybe at the North Pole, right, in the summer. It's, I don't know, it's contradictory, When things are positive, they're negative, and vice versa. Anyway, it seemed to be a contradiction which was hard for them to overcome. Note that I'm not telling you how to overcome it, but it's hard theoretically to understand that, though it's not hard to explain how we might get from, let's say, and this is what Keynes was really interested in, a recessionary gap back to here, and that was through government action. All right. And so here, I guess we get down to the brass tacks. The classical economists really suspected government action, and Keynes's theories said we needed them in case we fell into one of these other two situations to get back to that ideal state the classical economists liked. All right. So what follows is how the classical economists thought we did get back there without government intervention. So, and this is what we might call a self-regulating economy without government intervention. And so if we were in a recessionary gap, their unemployment rate is higher than the natural level of unemployment, frictional and structural together. And basically, that's going to put downward pressure on wages and maybe other inputs into the production process, like oil and other natural resources, because we're not producing at our maximum level. A lot of people are producing things they can't sell. So basically, there's going to be a fall in wages. In other words, and let's just say other cost of production, because they're all in surplus. In other words, the labor market, unemployment means a surplus. I might have to talk about this. So here's labor, here's the wage rate, here's the demand curve, here's the supply curve. Here would be the real equilibrium wage. And so if we have unemployment, W, let's call H, is higher than equilibrium, and we find the quantity of labor supplied at that high price, and this is the quantity of labor demanded by business firms, and it's less, and so we have a surplus in the labor market, and basically there will be downward pressure on wages, and as there's downward pressure on wages, fewer people will want to work at those lower real wages. Employers will be willing to hire more, and basically, according to the classical economist, we move towards equilibrium, back to equilibrium, and that's how it works. And basically remember that supply curves, short-run supply curves, are indicative of cost. And as those costs fall, the supply curve moves this way. You can offer more at the same price level. And then as there would be as prices and price level fell, we would move back to short run and long run equilibrium here. So in other words, the markets would bring us back into equilibrium, as I said before, with lower price level, or at least a reduced inflation rate, maybe deflation, maybe lower inflation rate. But you wouldn't need the government, you just would need to let the markets work themselves out, and we would come back to long-run equilibrium at full employment. No need for the government to get involved. All right, so I need to put this here. On the other side, and this is a textbook explanation, if we're in an inflationary gap, basically there are shortages in the labor market. So we'll draw the labor market again, put labor here, the wage rate here. I'd like a little thinner line. Whoops. The demand for labor by business firms, the supply of labor by households. And I should probably indicate that business firms demand labor, households supply it, and that is, I know I used before, H for high. So I should probably spell this out, households. So in this situation, the equilibrium wage rate is here, but we have a situation where the wage rate is lower than equilibrium. The quantity demanded by business firms in this inflationary situation is right here, Q sub D, at that low price rate. And this is the quantity supplied at that low wage rate. And so if there's a shortage in a labor market, economists think that wages will be bid up. As they're bid up, more workers will be willing to work and to work longer hours. As it's bid up, business firms will want to hire less. And eventually, we will move, get a finer point on this, we will move up to the equilibrium. But the big thing is wages and other costs. So wages and other input costs are rising due to this overall shortage in the economy. Just a slight tangent here before we get on. You know, whenever economists hear, and it usually was for nursing or let's say agricultural workers or other things, that there's a big shortage, we need to bring a lot of people in from abroad, we need to train many more nurses, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, that was the business firms or the employer's point of view. And economists were saying, well, you know what they're really saying is we don't want to pay the equilibrium wage. We want to pay these low wages. We'd like the government to do something to increase the supply so that we don't have to raise wages. And economists would say, just raise wages. Come on. You'll find people if you can get the wages high enough. And of course, business firms would say, we'll go bankrupt. We wouldn't hire them. But yeah, usually when you hear that business about we need to increase the supply of labor, it just means the business firms aren't willing to pay the equilibrium wage rate, not surprisingly. And this is basically a classical and liberally 19th century view. They'd say, don't think that business firms don't like government intervention. They do, especially if it benefits them, and they're always asking for the government to intervene on their side. So there you go. And anyway, so what's going to happen here is that costs are going to be going up. Again, this represents cost. And so we're going to be seeing the short run aggregate supply shift to the left. Let's see if the next one, and here we do. And so essentially it does shift to the left and we come back at full employment output, but at a higher price, which is of course the inflation. So really look at how much prices have gone up. Maybe originally Who knows? Aggregate demand, as I had said earlier, this was the original one, and the price level originally was here. So after all is said and done, there's been a large increase in the price level. And that's how the economy moves back to full employment output without government intervention. You just let the markets go to equilibrium, and every place they're in disequilibrium. So the policy implication here is laissez-faire. Let us pass. New classical, and monetarist economists believe the economy is self-regulating, and if we were to use the term of people who are enemies of the market, don't like the market working out, basically, I should use their term, and that would be neoliberalism. I think in the United States we don't like to use that because liberalism has come to mean a very soft socialism. But truly, I think this is probably a pretty good term, neoliberalism. And basically, people who don't like to let the markets work themselves out, whether in the left-wing view, they're fascist. Benito Mussolini, back in the 20s and 30s, who had been a socialist. And, you know, these people might controvert whether fascist is a right-wing thing. They would think it's a left-wing version, and then the left wing tries to wash its hands of it, like Lady Macbeth washing her hands after the murder of someone in the way of her husband becoming king. Or the left wing, you know, communists, socialists, progressives. So from both sides, these people are getting it. Anyway, a public policy of not interfering with market activities in the economy, we will come back to equilibrium if we just let the markets come out, and we'll have a much sounder economy if the government doesn't intervene. So there you go. And self-regulating economy. And here's sort of what I had hinted at, is that here we are in long-run equilibrium, situation one. For some reason, aggregate demand increases were not mentioned here at all, but it could be due to government policy. And so we move up here. Basically, we get to above full employment equilibrium, and price levels start rising. But then the cost of producing things start rising, so the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts back. And in the long run, we move from 1 to 2 to 3, and that's how an inflationary gap is closed in classical economic theory. So here we have 1, we're here. For some reason, aggregate demand goes down. Classical economists would think the government has done some action which has caused this. And so we move from equilibrium 1 to equilibrium 2, putting downward pressure on prices and output. And then because wages and other input costs are falling, the short-run aggregate supply curve moves out, and we move back into full employment output with even lower prices, but output bounces right back. And I should come here and say output bounces back over in the inflationary gap too, but at a much lower price level. Boom. But we're back at full employment output. And over here, we go, whoops, this way and right back. We're back to full employment output, but at a much higher price level. All right, so classical economists believe that's how the economy worked. Let me go to home, and I think I will add a slide. I think this one here. I'm going to give you a version, a modern version of classical economics that was developed in the 70s and then was further refined, but it was called adaptive expectations. So basically, people's expectations adapt as the situation changes. And this goes back to, oh, that's supposedly a straight line. Yeah, that's better. So we have origin here, price level measured by some sort of index. The only index we've looked in depth at was a CPI. Let's just say it's that. And we have real output here, real GDP, Q, in the terms of the textbook, Arnold textbook we're using. So Arnold would say this was Q sub n. Now let me see if I can do a better job on this vertical line. We get it up like that. And this is the long run aggregate supply. And this is the full employment output. All right. And we'll put the short run aggregate supply curve in. And remember, this is not necessarily an equilibrium, but what it does show, and I think in our previous graph, we had put a P with an E as a superscript, and let's just use this as what? The original expected price level. So P sub E equals expected price level, or you can think of it as inflation rate. All right, that's the expected one, all right? And let's just talk about maybe a recession occurring. So let me label this. This is the original one. And let's get aggregate demand in here. That's the original one. I would like a finer point on that, maybe. Maybe that. And then for some reason, aggregate demand falls. Note that I'm not really going into why would aggregate demand fall like that. So aggregate demand shifts to the left. We are now down here. I hope I've left enough room for myself. And so the actual, and that is an actual price level, is less than the expected. So actual is less than the expected price level at an original level, all right? And basically people in the economy, workers and businesses, will adapt. In other words, now they'll come after a while to expect this price level. So this will become the expected price level at this point, okay? And what that means is that the short run aggregate supply curve will go right through here. In other words, this is the expected level. So the short run aggregate supply curve always intersects the long run aggregate supply curve expected level. Oh, and so basically now we'll have a new equilibrium, and I guess we should put in, so originally it was way down here to Q sub 1, and I guess my numbers are a little, should have thought this out better before I did it. So now we're to Q sub 2, because price levels and costs have fallen, like in the textbook thing, but output is increased, but not to full employment yet. And it will be at an even lower price level. So let's call this P2. And then people will come to expect this price level. They will adapt to the new falling price level without government intervention. And the short run aggregate supply curve will go right through the long run at this new expected level. So this is the short run aggregate supply 2. And notice that price levels, this is going to be P3, and this is going to be Q3. Output has increased, price levels have decreased even more, but we're not quite back to equilibrium. Let's just take us all the way to equilibrium. I don't have much more space to deal with here. Let's see if this is a finer point. I think that's okay. So really, in the end, we're going to be back here eventually at short run aggregate supply N. And so we have basically, whoops, let me, rounds of changing expectations. And I know we start at 0, then we go to the first round, then the second, and the third, and that's what I've done. And then boop, 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 how many more rounds? We finally get to the nth. But basically, in the long run, we get back to full employment equilibrium in this model. We'll see that Keynes and the Keynesians will ask is, how long will this take? All right, I could do it with an inflationary gap too. Yikes, I need to get better at drawing these graphs. But I think the ideas are there, and indeed, you're likely to hear this, especially if you're majoring in business and economics, adaptive expectations, and really the, make sure I have a finer point there, that's okay. This theoretically was changed to rational expectations. I have to keep below that line or it doesn't record. And the answer to this question, which I'm not sure is true, but the answer was immediately. If you just communicate the idea that, hey, we're going to have these policies, we're not going to change. Don't think that we're going to be changing policies constantly, keeping you out of equilibrium. Well, in that case, the rational expectations would say, well, if you went into a recession, whoops, let's come back with this red, here, it would take no time at all to get back to here, as people that came to expect a consistent and unchanging governmental policy as far as monetary policy, taxing policy, and spending policy. So that was the rational expectations, which it looks like to me, looks a lot like what we had down here, right? Basically, we would go to here and then maybe quickly go to here. All right. So the textbook and these rational and adaptive expectations don't contradict each other. I just thought I'd bring those up so you would know about them. And that's it for lecture number 27.